the Ukrainians in the Kherson region finished regrouping and conducted another wave of assaults. They successfully breached the next defense line of the northern Russian group and are increasing the concentration of their forces and intensity of their attacks along the southern front line. The Ukrainians have achieved notable success in developing their counteroffensive operation further. And here is how they did it. Last time the Ukrainians stopped on the line Dudchany, Nova Kamianka, Bruskynske. As you remember, after the Ukrainians breached the Russian defense in Dudchany and collapsed their western flank, the northern Russian group was forced to immediately retreat from the Novovoskresenske area down to Nova Kamianka to avoid being taken into a pocket. Having liberated such a vast territory that is around 20 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide, the Ukrainians needed to take some for regrouping. The Ukrainians cleared Velika Oleksandrivka and the towns nearby, and they moved their forces across the river to create an even line of attack. Simultaneously, a lot of forces were relocated from Mykolaiv. Later, Russian sources reported an increased concentration of Ukrainian forces around Pozad-Pokrovsk, Snayarivka and Davydiv Brid. As I told you before, for safety reasons, the Ukrainians kept most of their forces on the western side of the Inhulets River and relocated them across the river for attacks only whenever necessary. So, most reserves have been located in the area of Berezhny-Huvate. It looks like they moved their forces from Berezhny-Huvate to the northern front, while the reinforcement from Mykolaiv substituted these forces. Overall, this is very bad news for the Russians because the Ukrainians managed to increase the number of troops engaged in combat while shortening the front line. If a week ago, the Ukrainians involved around 40,000 soldiers in storming the 200 kilometers long front line, then now, it is estimated that at least 45,000 troops are engaged in storming the 150 kilometers long front line. So, if previously there were 200 Ukrainians per kilometer, then now there are 300 Ukrainians per kilometer. And the Ukrainians are putting this advantage to good use. After reinforcements arrived, the Ukrainians immediately started to storm Nova Kamianka and the nearby settlements. Simultaneously, the Ukrainians in Havrylivka advanced on Dudchany. In light of the latest event, the Russians were preparing to abandon these positions, so the Ukrainians very quickly established control over the northern part of the town, which is separated from the southern by a small gulf. This is a very inconvenient line of defense, because the Russians here are very vulnerable to flank attacks, given the emptiness of the ground around them. Nonetheless, Nova Kamianka is still one of a few relatively big settlements that could allow holding defense for a while, and it seems like they used it just to slow the Ukrainians down because when the Ukrainians finally breached Russian defense in Typhonivka and started taking Nova Kamianka in a pocket from two sides, the Russians began to run away. Some Russian insiders said that it could no longer be characterized as a retreat. It could only be called a race because the Ukrainians were driving their armored cars at full speed through the field in an attempt to catch the Russian retreat while the Russians were running straight to Sukhanov. In the end, the Ukrainians to the west of Nova Kamianka had to engage with Russian forces advancing from Piatihatki, while the Ukrainians to the east did not advance fast enough to catch them. In any case, the Russians here were forced to make another 5 to 10 kilometers step back to establish the next line of defense on the Bruskynske, Borozensk, Mylov line. In the meantime, some reports suggest that the Ukrainians have started to storm Pravdine and Snayarivka. Others say that it was a feint and that the Ukrainians are actually storming Ternovy Poti while the Russians are retreating from Snayarivka. The situation around Kherson is less clear, but in any case, we can finally observe increased activity along the southern part of the front line. Given that the Ukrainians here have received some reinforcements, we can expect more news coming from this direction in the near future. If you are against the invasion of Ukraine and want to support the work that I am doing, consider making a purchase in the online store UA Supporter. Here you can find a lot of products with Ukrainian symbols, to not only show your support for this channel, but also for Ukraine.